This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Hey, what's up, and welcome to QnA, the show where I take your questions and answer them here in video format. A ton of things to get into, so let's just get into these questions. First question comes from Brutus, who says this: do you know when Juan Thornhill's coming back? I can't even remember how he got injured or if he still hasn't recovered from last year. He recovered from last year. He came back this season, played a couple games, got injured again. I believe Juan is on IR right now, so he is going to be scheduled to come back, I think, maybe week 6, maybe week 7. But the Browns are missing Juan Thornhill. I know a lot of people were wondering if Juan Thornhill is the same thing as John Johnson III. Look, John Johnson III is not half the run defender that Juan Thornhill was when he played out there. So I think Juan's presence in run defense is actually being missed, and it's something that the Browns could really use, because Ronnie Hickman, he does a good job of making sure that no disasters happen, but Ronnie Hickman, sometimes he doesn't recognize when there's a chance for him to make a play or when he needs to step up and get out of his cloud. So let's see here. Do you foresee the Browns getting back to higher usage of 12 personnel, getting more to the Stefanski roots? I've heard a lot of questions. I got a lot of questions this week about the Browns getting back to the Stefanski roots. Do they need to just go back to that old thing? And I think the answer is no. The Browns' old thing didn't work that great last year, whether it was Kevin Stefanski running it with Deshaun Watson or even with Joe Flacco. I understand the offense was a bit more exciting, but the Browns also turned the ball over quite a bit with that offense because it was kind of predictable. Like, the signs were there last year that the Browns needed to evolve what they do, and if they have to go through growing pains to evolve the offense, and I think that's what they have to do, and they have to just deal with. It might not be the pleasant thing right now, it might not be the sexy thing, but I do think that, look, you're living in a dream world if you don't think this offense has to evolve from what they did last year. So I think that's why Ken Dorsey is here. I don't think this is exclusively to build an offense around Deshaun Watson. This is also to just evolve what it is that Kevin Stefanski knows what to do well from that West Coast principle stuff, you know, the stuff that he's learned from the Kubiak tree. But now it's time for him to evolve these concepts and move forward with it. So I think no matter what, you're going to have to get used to the Browns looking a little bit different, because I don't think they can just go back to the old thing, because the old thing had its own problems too. Got to evolve. Next question comes from D. Charles, who says, when, if ever, will we see Jamari Thrash? Do you think it's worth exploring giving him reps that have gone to Tillman? Very different attributes, obviously. Look, I like Jamari Thrash. I was one of the people who was really excited that the Browns got Jamari Thrash, but I think we need to let this bake in the oven a little bit, right? Like, we want to microwave this thing and get Jamari Thrash on the field as soon as possible. And maybe when the time is right, he will get on the field this year, but there's really no need to rush his development right now. I think Jamari Thrash is getting prepared to have a bigger role potentially next year or later this year, but there's really no need to rush him onto the field. I get that there's excitement there because he played well in the preseason, but the development of this player is the number one priority, and it might not be great for his development to play super early, especially when the team's struggling. So I understand why people want Jamari Thrash out there. But I also don't see what Jamari Thrash is going to provide that's going to be that different than what Cedric Tillman does. Also, I don't know what Jamari Thrash is as a run-blocking wide receiver. He might not be good at that. You know, I think that might be also the case, that he's just not a good run-blocking wide receiver. And when you already have Jerry Jeudy, who can't run-block either, out there, you can't really multiply that issue. You feel me? UK Browns fans, do the Browns O-line struggles concern you about Nick Chubb's return and his chance of return to his former self? Or do you think coming off injury, Chubb is good enough to elevate those struggles? Nick Chubb is going to be expected to be Nick Chubb once he comes back from this injury, or at least somewhere close to Nick Chubb when he comes back to from this injury. And you're going to expect him to be able to overcome not so great offensive line play more often than not. That's just the expectation with Nick Chubb. You don't go out of your way to anticipate a player coming back as long as we have anticipated Nick Chubb coming back, to expect him to be just like every other running back who's dependent on the offensive line. The reason you're excited about Nick Chubb is because he's a running back that can make plays happen when the offensive line isn't perfect, right? The reason you love Nick Chubb is because the line doesn't have to be perfect for Nick Chubb to produce. And that's what people are going to hope for. So this idea that, because the offensive line isn't perfect, we should just sit Nick Chubb, I think it's silly. One, Nick Chubb's going to age whether he plays football or not. Like, there is this idea out there that, like, football players don't age as long as they're not playing football. But every single one of us watching this video does not play football, most certainly ages, right? Like, ages, you're still going to age even if you're not taking the hits from playing football. And for Nick Chubb, it's like, oh yeah, sit him. Why would you sit him? He's getting close to 30. He's only going to get older. He's still going to age if you don't play him. I just don't get the mindset behind that. Like, I get the thinking that sparks it. You want to protect Nick Chubb and make sure that he can only play meaningful football, but he's got to play the football that's in front of him. And then if that football is meaningful, then that football is meaningful. So yeah, Nick Chubb getting out there, I don't worry about him because of the offensive line not being perfect. And this isn't a quarterback. Like, I don't get this. This is a very quarterbacky argument that you don't want to put this guy in because the offensive line is great. Like, the running back's going to get hit no matter what. Even if the offensive line is great, if the offensive line is bad, the running back is going to get hit. Like, it doesn't really change much as far as, like, injury protection for a running back, whether the offensive line is good or not. Like, maybe rushing attempts has an effect on that. How many times that player gets hit, right? That increases the odds that something could go wrong. But the quality of the offensive line, that's never been a factor in if a running back can stay healthy. He's not a quarterback. I think we're just getting used to, like, all of these quarterback arguments, and now we're just using quarterback arguments for anybody. And that just doesn't make sense to me. The next question. Appreciate the question, by the way. I hope you don't take it like I'm not trying to be an asshole or anything like that. I'm just saying I get the thought process that gets you there, but also keep in mind he's not a quarterback. So it's not necessarily something you would have to worry about. Gagan says, do you think the notion of defense only goes as far as the offensive line is unacceptable on a certain level? No, that's just football. If you build a defense that's built through your defensive line, then the defensive line has to be good. If you build a defense that's built through your secondary, then your secondary has to be. Every defense is built on top of a supposed strength that they're supposed to have. Either it's the secondary or it's the defensive line. It's not unacceptable that that's the case. That's just the reality of any team. Even teams that have good secondaries but have great defensive lines, they're built through their defensive lines, vice versa, right? The Legion of Boom built a great secondary. They had a good defensive line in those days, but that team was built around the strength of that secondary. It's just what it is. You're going to have to pick one area of the defense, strengthen that area of the defense, and that's the area that the defense is going to flow through. This is football. The next question comes from P Money, who says, do you think adding David and Nick back to the offense will open up things downfield for Cooper? I assume with how to use David and the threat of Nick, that would bring defense closer to the line of scrimmage, which could lead to some more shots for the offense. I don't think it's that simple. Like, it's not chess where you're just going to put a player here and that's going to force a defense to do these things every time that player is out there. What I do think it does, though, is having David Njoku and Nick Chubb back, is it gives you a focal point on offense, right? It gives you something to focus the offense through, right? You can play through Nick Chubb. You can play through David Njoku. Right now, I think the biggest problem with the offense is what people have brought up. They have no identity. Well, how do you get an identity? You got to have a focus on the offense. Usually when you have an identity on defense or offense, it's usually centered around a great player. right? Like that's usually where the center of the identity comes from. If you're a run the football team, it's usually because you got somebody like Derrick Henry or Nick Chubb. If you're a deep passing team, it's usually because you got somebody like a Pat Mahomes or somebody like a Justin Herbert who could throw it deep. Your identity is going to be molded after your best player on offense. And right now, the Browns don't really have a best player on offense. Like, they have a player who's technically playing the best on offense every week, obviously, because somebody has to be it. But when we're circling guys and we're talking about the Browns' best player on offense, they don't really have an obvious name that pops up right now. Like, Amari Cooper hasn't been playing at that level. Deshaun Watson hasn't played consistently at that level in a long time. And the same can be said for Jerry Jeudy, et cetera, et cetera. Like, none of these guys are at that point to where, like, there are legitimate, okay, we're playing Cleveland, we got to worry about this guy. That's just not where the game plan is for Cleveland right now. But if you get David Njoku back, now you have somebody that other defensive coordinators have to circle. If you get Nick Chubb back, now you have somebody that other coordinators have to circle. It's no mistake. Every time the Browns play somebody and Nick Chubb potentially playing is in the news, you'll hear these teams really get focused in on that piece of news. Will Nick Chubb play, right? Because that is the focal point of the Browns offense, and that's the identity. That's what it gives the Browns. It gives them an identity. It gives them a focal point. It gives them a real offense when you have Nick Chubb and David Njoku, because now you can play things off of the attention, like you said in your question, that David and Nick Chubb are going to get. But it's much bigger than that, right? Your identity is in your best players, and right now the Browns just don't have one on offense. I think that's the biggest thing those players provide. Steve says this, I've thought about it for a while, but it seems like whenever Watson is the starter, the vibes are off with the entire team. I'm wondering why that might be. Is it a coincidence, or is there something to that perception? I think there's something to that perception. Like, I feel it too when Watson plays. There's a bit more tension. I don't know if it's a projection or not, and it might be a projection because I might be projecting how I know people are going to react if Deshaun does not play well into how I feel about what's going on, right? Because if Deshaun doesn't play well, everybody's mad. It's going to be a miserable week to talk about the Browns. And maybe that's being projected onto Deshaun. All I can say is in the locker room, I'm not sure about that, right? With the fan base, yeah, I think there's something to that. But in the locker room, it's a completely different world there. I don't know how they feel about Deshaun Watson. I don't know if that locker room believes in Deshaun Watson. Like, we just don't know these things. We could project these things onto the locker room, but that's not what's actually going on in that locker room. So I don't know. I don't know how they feel about Deshaun. I just know how I feel and how Browns fans who interact with me feel about Deshaun. And if it's similar to how the players feel, then that's not going to be a good thing. But I think I have to be careful about knowing what the vibe is amongst fans versus projecting what the fans are feeling onto what we must think the players are feeling, because the players just don't live in fan world like we do. Like, we consume the Browns 24/7. We talk about the Browns. We talk about whoever talks about the Browns. We have all these hot takes. We listen to all the shows. We are diehard Browns fans for the most part on this channel. But Browns players just work for the Browns. So, like, they do their practice. They're not doing all this shit that we're doing. They're not feeling the same things that we're feeling. And they have much more information than we have about where the team is as far as, like, a mental place or not. So that's all I'm saying. I have no clue where the locker room is, and I think we should all acknowledge that we don't really have a clue on where the locker room is, because as bad as Deshaun Watson had been at times this season, we never got those, like, unnamed player says this about Deshaun Watson and all this, and that would indicate that the locker room, that he's lost the locker room. I've seen nothing tangible that indicates that Deshaun has truly lost the locker room. So I can't just sit here and project how I feel onto the Browns locker room, if that makes sense. So I want to be careful about that. Bo Knox says, how do you think the Browns are going to handle Chubbs' return? Think he'll play this week on a snap count or hold on to next week? They'll let him get a full week of practicing. They've already ruled him out for the Washington game. And then they'll probably see how he responds to practice next week. I think if he's good to go, they'll give him a full practice, see how he responds to that, rest him the day after, and then decide if they want to play him. If they do, they're probably going to play him limited snaps and then kind of work him in easy. It might be 2 games of limited snaps. It might be 3 games of limited snaps, but they'll work him in slowly but surely for sure. But that's it for Q&A. I want to thank you guys for asking these questions. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.